They say your life can change in a single afternoon, and I am living proof of that. It was the third round of chemotherapy, and I had barely recovered enough strength to climb out of the hospital bed when I got the call to report to the 42nd floor conference room, the same floor where my name had been engraved on the glass for over 2 decades. I walked in with a body weakened by treatment but a heart still holding on to hope, clinging to the belief that my years of loyalty to Winford, Solutionson, Oregon-based home tech company, where I had worked my way up from an unpaid intern to vice president of strategic planning still, meant something. But I was wrong. Tom, the newly appointed CEO young enough to be my song, greeted me with a carefully rehearsed smile that carried more pity than respect. With clinical detachment, he read from a prepared statement about necessary restructuring in light of evolving market demands. I can't recall every word he said, only the way the assistant I'd once mentored refused to meet my eyes, staring down at the table like she wasn't watching a woman's dignity being neatly folded into a severance envelope. The offer, a generous retirement package, time to focus on my health, and a quiet exit. That was how they repaid 22 years of blood, sweat, and weekends spent alone in airports while the company soared on my strategies. I didn't cry. I stood there in that glass-walled room bathed in late afternoon sun and watched the building I helped shape turn into something cold and unfamiliar. Just months earlier, I had been honored in a local business journal as a pioneer in smart home innovation. But now, thanks to a few abnormal scans and a stage 2 diagnosis, I was nothing more than a risk on their spreadsheet, too old, too sick, too easy to replace. As I left the building holding a cardboard box filled with old photos and a half-read pathology report, I realized I had nowhere to go. My family in Seattle had long since grown distant, especially after I declined their offers to settle down with someone stable before it was too late. I had chosen career over comfort, independence over marriage. And now, with both stripped away, I felt like a relic discarded and devalued. Without really thinking, I started to drive a knot home. Not anywhere in particular, just south along I-5, hoping that putting miles between me and everything I'd built might somehow dull the pain. Rain began to fall softly, streaking across the windshield like unspoken regrets. Then, as if the day hadn't already taken enough from me, my SUV, the same one I'd driven to dozens of board meetings, began to sputter and died near a lonely gas station outside of Medford. I didn't even have the energy to be angry. I turned on the hazard lights and sat still, my hands over my face, wondering how much further I could fall. That's when I heard the knock on the window, gentle, tentative. I looked up to see a man in a grease-streaked jumpsuit peering in with concern rather than suspicion. "Looks like you've got engine trouble," he said, voice deep and steady. "Want me to take a look?" I couldn't speak at first. Exhaustion had stolen my voice, but something about the way he spoke, without pity, without presumption, made me nod. He opened the hood and poked around in silence, then told me I could wait inside the small shop behind the station while he worked. I don't know why I trusted him. Maybe it was the way he didn't flinch at my tired eyes or thinning hair. Maybe it was just that, for the first time in weeks, someone was offering help without asking for anything in return. I stepped into a tiny room that smelled of burnt coffee and oil, with an old radio playing jazz in the corner and a single light flickering above the desk. And though I didn't know it then, that oil-stained garage and the man who quietly handed me a chipped mug of tea would soon change everything. That night in the garage wasn't meant to be anything more than a pit stop, just a stranger helping a woman who looked more broken than the car she arrived in. But sometimes, life threads its miracles through the smallest cracks, and if we're paying attention, we just might catch them before they pass. His name was Luke Jensen, and he wasn't like anyone I had known in the polished world of Portland's executive elite. He didn't rush his words or mask them behind a smile designed to manipulate. His hands, rough with calluses and stained by years of engine grease, moved with a kind of reverence over the hood of my Caras. If fixing things wasn't just a skill but a philosophy. He told me the fuel pump had gone, explained how he could get a refurbished part by morning, and then, almost as an afterthought, offered me a ride to the nearest motel or at least some hot tea while I waited. I accepted the tea. It came in a cracked ceramic mug with a faded bluebird on the side, and the water tasted slightly of iron, but in that moment, it was the warmest thing I'd held in weeks. We sat in the back of the shop, a space cluttered with old manuals, mismatched chairs, and a dog-eared calendar from 2007. Outside, the rain had become heavier, tapping against the windows like a restless drumbeat, but inside it was quiet, peaceful, almost broken only by the occasional hiss of the space heater and the soft music playing from a dusty radio in the corner. I didn't mean to tell him my story. I wasn't looking for sympathy, and I certainly didn't expect understanding. But when he asked what brought me out that far alone, something in me unraveled. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the way he listened, not just nodding, but actually hearing the parts no one else ever stayed long enough to notice. I told him about the diagnosis, the termination, the years I had given to people who saw me as a line item, not a human being. I told him about the family who stopped calling when I chose a boardroom over a baby shower, and how, for the first time in 48 years, I had no title, no direction, and no one waiting for me when the day ended. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer platitudes about everything happens for a reason or you'll bounce back. He just said, "I'm glad you made it here," and somehow, those 6 words landed deeper than any sympathy card or HR email ever had. The next morning, he fixed the car. He even cleaned the floor mats and topped off the fluids, refusing payment for anything beyond the part cost. When I tried to tip him, he shook his head and told me to save it for something that mattered. I drove away, watching the shop disappear in my rearview mirror, convinced I would never see him again. But life, as it often does, had other plans. A week later, I was back not because of another car problem, but because I couldn't stop thinking about how calm I had felt in that cluttered room, how safe I had been in the company of a man who saw me not as broken or burdensome, but simply as someone worth listening to. I brought coffee this time, and as we drank it under the same flickering light, I learned more about Luke. He'd once been on a very different path engineering school, full scholarship, the kind of mind that could have built satellites or run labs at NASA. But life had turned hard and unfair. He lost his mother to pancreatic cancer just 3 months before graduation. She had no insurance, and he left school to take care of her full-time, selling off his future to keep her comfortable until the end. After that, he never went back. Said he didn't trust systems that valued degrees more than decency. He told me he opened that garage not because he loved cars, though he did, but because it gave him the power to fix what others threw away. There was something poetic about that, something deeply human, and over the next few months, I found myself visiting more and more often, sometimes with excuso rattling noise, a slow oil leak, but more often with none at all. We'd sit, talk, eat takeout on the hood of my car, or walk the empty roads behind the station as the sun dipped behind the hills. No suits, no meetings, no expectations, just 2 people who had been burned by the world, slowly learning how to feel warm again. I didn't fall for him all at once. It wasn't cinematic like that. But I noticed the way he remembered how I liked my tea, how he never looked away from my scarred arm when I rolled up my sleeve, how he treated my cancer like something I lived with, not something that defined me. I hadn't realized how starved I was for that kind of simple, unfiltered kindness until he gave it to me without asking for anything back. 6 months later, I had given up my apartment in Portland and moved into his modest 2-bedroom house outside Grants Pass. It wasn't fancy. The walls creaked in winter, and the hot water took too long to heat. But it was the first place I'd lived where I didn't feel like I was performing for anyone. Luke didn't care how much I used to earn or who I used to be. He cared if I laughed that day, if I slept through the night without pain, if I felt strong enough to take a walk down to the river with him and listen to the frogs sing at dusk. Of course, the world didn't stop trying to drag me back. My former employer made quiet offers to collaborate on consulting work, once the press picked up on my condition and began championing my story as a corporate cautionary tale. My family sent carefully worded emails with invitations to holidays, all dripping with concern that sounded more like shame. But I didn't care anymore. I had walked away from a life where everything looked good on paper but left me hollow, and I had found something better, something rooted not in wealth or status but in choice, in dignity, and in the quiet, powerful kind of love that doesn't ask you to be anyone except exactly who you are. I knew there would be consequences the moment I told them. I just didn't expect the cruelty to be so calculated. It was a Sunday morning when I finally made the call. My father, Richard Carlisle, answered on the second ring, his voice clipped and cold, as if he already suspected I wasn't calling to make amends. "I'm getting married," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest, "to Luke." There was a pause. long enough that I thought the line had gone dead. Then came the laugh, sharp, mirthless, and laced with disbelief. "You're marrying the mechanic?" He spat, as though the word itself was a disease. "Have the medications finally scrambled your brain, Ellen?" Before I could respond, my mother's voice cut in. She must have been on speaker, as she often was during our family check-ins, which had grown shorter and more strained over the years. "This is madness," she said, her tone somewhere between pity and fury. "You've always been dramatic, but this is delusion. He's not your future. He's a symptom of your breakdown." I should have hung up. I should have ended the conversation right then and there. But I stayed, because some part of me, the part that still remembered birthday cakes shaped like ballerinas and goodnight kisses on fevered foreheads, wanted them to understand. "He's kind," I said. "He's steady. He makes me feel seen. Not as a patient, not as a project, as a person." But I wasn't talking to my parents anymore. I was talking to two shareholders terrified that their daughter, once the shining star of Carlisle dynamics, was about to shatter their carefully curated public image by choosing love over lineage. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "If you go through with this, you'll be cut off," he said, the words crisp and final, like the closing of a boardroom deal. No trust fund, no shares, no name. My mother, quieter but no less lethal, added, "and no place at the estate. Don't expect to show up here ever again, Ellen. If you walk away now, you walk for good." I didn't cry. Not in that moment. I think I'd already done all my grieving in silence in hospital beds, in lonely apartments, in the spaces between being someone's daughter, someone's employee, and no one at all. I said goodbye. And I meant it. I packed what little I had left into a single suitcase, the same one I used to carry during quarterly retreats at the company's Aspen Lodge, and walked out of the brownstone I'd grown up in, past the marble staircase, and the portraits of ancestors who looked down on me as if they too disapproved. I didn't look back. I knew if I did, I might hesitate, and I couldn't afford that kind of weakness anymore. Luke was waiting at the end of the driveway, his old Chevy idling at the curb, engine rattling slightly under the hood. He got out when he saw me and didn't say a word, just opened the passenger door and reached for my hand. His palm was warm, solid, and real. I held on like it was the only thing tethering me to the earth. We drove in silence for a while, past neighborhoods I'd once called home and office towers that bore my signature on their contracts. The farther we got from the world I had known, the more I began to breathe again, as if each mile was undoing the pressure that had lived inside my chest for decades. His house was humble, a weathered two-bedroom with peeling paint and creaky floorboards, nestled between a hardware store and a Lutheran church just outside Grants Pass. There was no security gate, no intercom system, no manicured hedge, just a small porch with mismatched chairs and a wind chime that sang when the breeze picked up. I moved in that night. We shared a closet, we shared grocery lists, we split bills and coupon books, and while my body still ached from treatment and my pride bore fresh bruises, I found that something inside me, something stubborn and quietly fierce, had started to mend. I took a consulting job with a local nonprofit that helped retrain middle-aged workers laid off from automation projects, people like me who had been told they were too slow, too old, too outdated to keep up. It didn't pay much, but it paid enough, and more importantly, it gave me a purpose that wasn't tied to quarterly profits or executive perks. My family didn't reach out after that. No calls, no emails, no half-hearted apologies or holiday cards. I suppose I should have felt abandoned, but instead, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Because for the first time in my life, I had chosen myself, not the expectations, not the legacy, not the version of me that existed on resumes and family Christmas letters, but the real me, the one who had been to hell and back and found someone worth losing everything for. And though the road ahead was uncertain and the bank account far from impressive, I was no longer afraid, because I had learned that sometimes the people who cut you off are doing you a favor. They're making space for you to become exactly who you were always meant to be. Life with Luke wasn't easy, but it was honest. We clipped coupons, shared a secondhand laptop, and learned how to stretch a single roast chicken across 3 meals. I swapped tailored suits for thrifted sweaters and traded high-stakes boardrooms for long walks by the river where we dreamed aloud about futures that didn't come with price tags. My illness, while still lingering like a shadow, no longer dictated the rhythm of my life, and though we lived modestly, Every day felt like something I had earned, not inherited or owed. But something began to shift. It started small, almost unnoticeably. A call he'd take in the hallway, a spreadsheet minimized when I entered the room, a blueprint left out on the table late at night when he thought I'd already gone to bed. At first, I chalked it up to his pride. Luke had always hated being seen as the reason I had settled down or started over. I assumed he was taking on more side work, maybe building custom tools or managing a few freelance repairs for the garages he occasionally helped out. I never suspected anything else, because Luke was the kind of man who didn't brag, didn't posture, didn't feel the need to perform his worth, and maybe that's why, when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't just catch me off guard. It left me breathless. That day had started like any other. I came home from the nonprofit a bit early, carrying takeout from the Thai place. He loved the one where they always added extra basil to his order without being asked. The house was quiet. A scribbled note sat on the counter, the ink slightly smudged, reading, "Working late, love you." But there was something off. His truck wasn't in the driveway, and when I called, it went straight to voicemail. My chest tightened, not from panic, not yet, but from a creeping instinct I couldn't quite place. I waited a few minutes, then got back into the car and drove to the garage, expecting to find him elbow deep in an old transmission or fixing a busted alternator under harsh fluorescent lights. But the shop was dark, the bay doors locked, and the lights out. And then my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, and the message was short. "Mrs. Carlisle, please come to 2000, 127 Lawson Avenue. It's about your husband." I don't remember the drive. I just remember gripping the wheel until my knuckles whitened, praying it wasn't a hospital address or worse. Lawson Avenue wasn't anywhere near his shop. It was in the city's industrial district, flanked by high-rises and new construction. When I arrived, a security gate opened without question, and a uniformed guard greeted me by name before escorting me to a private elevator that ascended straight to the top floor. I didn't understand what was happening until the elevator doors opened. What I saw was not a warehouse or a hospital, but a sleek, sunlit office floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, walls adorned with abstract art, and in the center, a glass desk behind which stood Luke. Except it wasn't Luke as I knew him. Gone were the oil-stained jeans and flannel shirts. He wore a charcoal gray suit, tailored to perfection, and when he turned to face me, the expression on his face was equal parts warmth and hesitation. "Charlie," he said softly, calling me by the name only he used. "I think it's time I tell you everything." Before he could explain, the door burst open. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, stormed in, their faces flushed, their posture rigid, followed closely by my ex-fiancé, Grant Bennett, whose expression was somewhere between shock and smug entitlement. "What is the meaning of this?" my father barked. "Security said you were meeting someone here. What are you doing in the CEO's office? Where is he?" Luke stepped forward calmly, buttoned his jacket, and said, "I'm right here." The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother gasped audibly, reaching for the edge of a chair for balance. My father's face went pale, the color draining from him faster than I thought possible. "You!" he choked. "You're... what?" "I'm Luke Jensen, founder and CEO of Sentinel Dynamics," he replied, his voice steady. "We design and manufacture cutting-edge battery systems for next-generation electric vehicles. You may have heard of US. We just signed exclusive deals with 3 major automakers last quarter." I turned to him stunned. "Why didn't you tell me?" His eyes softened. "Because when we met, you didn't fall in love with the CEO. You fell in love with a man in a garage who listened when no one else did. I needed to know you loved me for who I was, not what I had." My father was already calculating. "Sentinel Dynamics," he muttered. "You're the ones disrupting the lithium market. We tried to acquire one of your partners last year." He looked between us, realizing far too late what he had thrown away. "This changes everything." "No," Luke said sharply. "It changes nothing because you made it very clear who and what your daughter was worth to you. She walked away from all of that, and she never once looked back." Then, turning to me, he added, "And if you're willing, I'd like to bring you into this properly. As my wife, as my partner, as co-owner." Tears blurred my vision, not from shock, but from the overwhelming realization that this man had built an empire in silence, not to prove anything to the world, but to protect the purity of something real. something we had built in a world that had never once made space for people like us to choose love over legacy. As my parents stood there powerless, speechless, finally witnessing a life they had tried to erase rise stronger than ever, I simply reached for Luke's hand and said, "Yes." And in that moment, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows and a stunned silence more deafening than applause, I felt something I hadn't in years. Vindicated. When Luke and I decided to get married, we didn't want a spectacle. We didn't need chandeliers, embroidered napkins, or a guest list bloated with people who only cared about appearances. What we wanted was a memorial, grounded, and completely ours. So we planned something simple, an outdoor ceremony in the community park where Luke had taught underprivileged teens how to rebuild their first engines, a rented tent, folding chairs, and the scent of spring in the air. It wasn't grand, but it was honest. It was us. The morning of the wedding, just as I was zipping up my Dressa modest ivory piece I had found at a secondhand boutique, I heard my phone buzz. I wasn't expecting calls, but the name flashing on the screen stopped me cold. Mother. I hesitated, then opened the message. It read, "Your father and I will be attending. One last chance to fix this mistake." My stomach turned, not from nerves, but from the dull ache that only family can leave behind when they cut you open with love disguised as judgment. I showed Luke the message as he straightened his Tia navy blue one with tiny silver gears stitched in, a gift I'd given him the day he opened his second facility. He looked at the screen, then back at me, and said only, "It's your call." I wanted them there. For all their flaws, they were still my parents, and somewhere deep down, I held on to the hope that witnessing the life I had chosen on built not on legacy or status, but on mutual respect and quiet resilience might soften something inside them. They arrived just after the ceremony began, my father in a dark suit far too formal for a park, my mother in a pale lavender dress that looked better suited to a gala than a wedding on grass. They stood at the back, silent, watching from a distance as I walked down the aisle alone, my steps slow but certain, each one a declaration of independence wrapped in satin. They didn't speak during the vows. They didn't clap when we were pronounced husband and wife. They didn't even smile. But during the reception, nothing more than picnic tables, grilled chicken, and music played from someone's Bluetooth speaker, they made their move. My mother approached first, her smile stretched thin over barely contained desperation. "Darling," she said softly, placing a manicured hand on my arm. "There's still time. Grant would forgive all of this. He told us as much. You don't have to waste your life on this." She said the word "this" as if it were an infection, something that clung to me against my will. Before I could respond, my father stepped in, his tone sharp and unmistakably final. "This is your last opportunity, Ellen. Stay with this man, and you forfeit everything. Not just your inheritance, but your place in the family. You'll be on your own." It should have hurt more than it did. But as I looked at them two people so afraid of anything that didn't fit their blueprint of success, so bound by image and status they couldn't see the person standing in front of them, I realized I no longer needed their approval. I had built a life from broken pieces, one choice at a time, and I had done it without their money, their name, or their rules. "I don't need your inheritance," I said, my voice steady, the air stilling around us like the moment before a storm. "And I'm not alone. I have a husband who loves me without conditions, a life that doesn't need polishing to be beautiful, and a future that finally feels like mine." My father's jaw clenched. "Then you're no daughter of mine." He turned and walked away, not even waiting for my mother, who lingered for a second longer, tears brimming in her eyes, but pride keeping her feet planted. Eventually, she followed him, her heels sinking slightly into the grass with each step. Luke was there before I had time to exhale, wrapping an arm around my waist and kissing my temple, as if the world hadn't just cracked in two. "You okay?" he asked. I leaned into him, watching the backs of the two people who once controlled every chapter of my life disappear into the blur of dusk and disappointment. "Never better," I whispered, and I meant it not as a performance, not to prove a point, but because standing there, in that park surrounded by folding chairs and people who actually cared, I finally felt free. 6 months later, they still hadn't reached out. Not for holidays, not for birthdays, not even to acknowledge the articles beginning to circulate about Luke's latest innovations or the nonprofit grants I was helping allocate through the foundation he named after his mother. But what they didn't realize, what they never could, was that I wasn't living in spite of them anymore. I was living without them. And it turned out that made all the difference. Things didn't change overnight. There were no yachts, no red carpets, no sudden transformation from small town simplicity to jet-setting affluence. The truth is, even after that day after my family's stunned retreat from our wedding and the reveal of Luke's true identity, life carried on, as life always does, in a mix of quiet victories and lingering struggles that didn't resolve with a single kiss or a signature on a company letterhead. We moved into a modest home just outside Ashland, Oregon, a mansion, not a modern smart house with automated blinds and touchscreen countertops, but a warm, lived-in cottage with a wide front porch, shelves lined with used books, and a backyard just big enough to grow tomatoes and host summer cookouts. It wasn't the house I used to imagine as a young girl flipping through real estate magazines in my father's study, but it was ours, chosen together, brick by brick, moment by moment. Luke kept his promise to stay grounded. He still spent several days a week at the original garage, not because he needed to, but because it reminded him of who he was before the billion-dollar valuation, before the boardrooms and interviews and flashbulbs. He mentored teens from broken homes, teaching them not just how to rebuild engines, but how to believe in their own hands, their own minds, their own capacity to create something real from pieces others had given up on. As for me, I found purpose not in reclaiming the power I once had, but in building something that felt more honest than the titles I wore in my former life. I became Director of Community Engagement for the Jensen Initiative, foundation Luke created in memory of his mother, dedicated to supporting overlooked entrepreneurs, especially older adults pushed out of the workforce due to age, illness, or economic shifts. I had once been one of them, forgotten despite my experience, discarded because I no longer fit the image. Now, I spent my days helping others prove that their best chapters hadn't been left behind, just postponed. My family remained distant, though not entirely silent. Every now and then, I'd get a stiff email from my mother asking if I was comfortable or if I'd reconsider reconciliation, usually followed by a veiled offer to return home or meet for lunch at the club. My father said nothing at all, at least not to me directly. But I knew from Luke's assistant that Carlisle Dynamics had floated the idea of a strategic partnership with Sentinel twice, and both times Luke declined the meeting without hesitation. We weren't interested in payback. We weren't chasing headlines or revenge. What we wanted, what we built, was a life that wasn't dependent on anyone else's permission to matter. And yet, on quiet nights, when the world slowed and the air grew heavy with the scent of pine and promise, I would sometimes catch Luke looking at me the same way he had that very first day back when I was a woman lost between a diagnosis and a layoff, and he was a mechanic with a secret and a soul that refused to be measured in dollars. One evening, as we sat together on the porch swing watching the sun dip below the horizon, I finally asked him the question that had lingered at the back of my mind for months. Why did you wait to tell me who you really were? He turned to me, his voice low, steady, but thick with truth. Because I didn't want you to love the version of me the world admires. I needed to know you loved the version no one else ever bothered to see. That was when I realized revenge doesn't always wear sharp suits or come with a headline-grabbing twist. Sometimes, the sweetest form of justice is living well, not to prove anything, but simply to be free. Free from fear, free from expectations, free to choose love that isn't fragile or performative, but strong enough to rebuild a life from the ruins of the one you left behind. And that's what we did. We didn't win the world. We just rebuilt our own. If this story touched you, if you've ever been pushed aside, told you were too old, too sick, too far gone, know this: your worth isn't behind you. It's still yours to claim. Leave a comment if you've ever had to start over. Subscribe for more stories like this. True, raw, and quietly powerful. Off. And remember, sometimes the softest revenge is simply living a life they said you never could.